Fair enough.
Welcome, everybody.
Thanks.
Really excited.
No problem.
Yeah, I can show you more later.
It's good to see such a nice turnout for our first CRLT Jacobs Chair speaker of the year. And I am delighted that it is my friend and colleague, Britte Cheng, who is opening up the series this year. Britte is principal and founder of Menlo EDU, which conducts rigorous innovative design and empirical projects to support powerful and equitable learning. Britte has also, before founding her own company, worked at SRI International for 12 years as principal scientist and co-lead of the Technology Enhanced Assessment and Learning Research Group. She got her PhD at Berkeley, and we have a grant together working on theorizing engagement that a couple of folks here are working on. And so that I don't take lots of time, I'm going to turn it over to Britte as she talks about aggregating knowledge in translational research approaches. So I'm looking forward to hearing. So let's welcome her.
Thank you. It's so nice to be called friend in an introduction. Thank you, Cindy. That was really lovely. And thank you all for coming and spending some time today. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you about some ideas that I'm grappling with, that I'm really trying to get some ways of communicating and thinking about more deeply. So really look forward to having a conversation with all of you and getting your feedback on the presentation and hearing about what connections you make to the work. So as Cindy said, I'm Britte Cheng, but you can just call me Britte. I left SRI in December of 2017 and started an independent research firm in Menlo Park, California, and I named it Menlo Education Research. I guess I can't ever move. But in California, you don't move anyway once you have a house. So the purpose of leaving SRI was multifold, but one of them was to be able to do work in different ways, in ways that were hard to do in the institution where I was, that had really high overhead, and had a mission that wasn't quite aligned with what I wanted to do. So SRI, for those who don't know, is a nonprofit research organization in Northern California. We had a Center for Technology and Learning there that had been in existence since the 90s. I got there around 2006. We had up to 80 folks in that center by the time I left and others started to leave that center. And so if you're interested in hearing about a non-academic career path, I would love to answer questions about that. I clearly don't, mind trying out new ways of working in order to do the work I think is important. I still love the academy. I would never trade these experiences of being in this kind of room with this amount of expertise and experience and passion, but I also really value being able to work in interstitial spaces, and I would love to be able to talk to anyone who's interested in that. So I'll give a little bit of work on a little bit of a discussion on my background, because I think it'll help you understand and build the argument that I'm making for why we need to start aggregating knowledge using some of the translational research approaches that have been coming up in the past 10 years or a little bit more than that. But I'll start with my advisor, Marcia Lin, who was in the STEM technology enhanced STEM learning K-12 space for quite a while when I got there. And when I started interviewing to go to graduate schools, she said the thing that got me to join her research group that really just hooked me forever, which was that classrooms are some of the last spaces where we can spark cultural change. So I'll just let that sit with you for a minute. That is a space where you can think about equity and social justice. It's obviously very important to me, so that's where I started. So with Marcia and in her research group, I was looking at K-12 STEM instruction, design, assessment design, and the development of learning technologies. Stayed there, for the typical amount of time, and started to feel that the work we were doing, both in my graduate career, but also then at SRI, was lacking the sort of systemic impact that I thought we should have, given the millions of dollars that we had from NSF. It was like, this thing I just did that took me 6 years and a lot of money and a lot of blood, sweat, equity is going to sit on a shelf. And I saw that happen over and over again. So I started wondering, how can research and practice better communicate with one another? It was a question a lot of people were asking around that time. I wasn't being a genius. So I started working with some of my SRI colleagues to think about how we might better design what we were building, be those learning technologies, be they instruction, be they policies or pedagogical approaches, whatever it was we were trying to develop to intervene in educational systems. How could we better design them to think about the kind of impact we wanted to have? So we started thinking about a form of research and design called design-based implementation research, which was really a culminating of lots of ideas that were floating around in the literature at the time. We just put them together in a set of ideas that we thought were important. But the idea was that you design for a variation of implementation context, so that when you start to see something about your design that maybe doesn't resonate so well in a local context, you can make adjustments. But you do that from the very beginning. And then there were other pieces of that work that we thought were important. That the work that you do focus on persistent problems of practice from multiple stakeholders' perspectives. We found that if you didn't attend to all the actors in the system, you weren't going to get uptake, pure and simple. That you commit to iterative and collaborative design with those stakeholders, develop theory, knowledge, and practice related to both classroom learning and implementation through systematic inquiry, and that as part of this work, you take seriously the goal of developing capacity in those systems for future change. I'm going to come back to that idea later. But those are some of the principles of DBIR. There's lots of work around it that we'll talk about also that relate methodologically, theoretically. They have lots of the same antecedents. One of the other ways I tried to think about building out the impact of our work was developing tools and methods that would allow us to share our approaches, our successes, and our failures. So I was trying to think about how can we put more infrastructure around this research so that we can better, as a community, function. And so one of the ways that I learned how to do that was from my assessment adolescence, when I started to learn how to develop assessments both for classroom and large scale. We at SRI used an approach called evidence-centered design. You don't need to know much about it. What you need to know is that it's a principled design approach that asks designers to articulate their conjectures, their design argument from the beginning. All of the design features, the way the design features might vary depending on what you were, where you were using your assessment, or with whom you were using your assessment, or what technology was available to use your assessment. So not just what is it that you think you're building, but what are some of the variants on it that won't break the purpose and design of the assessment from the beginning. One piece of work that I'll point to specifically was a piece that was published in Educational Research and Evaluation. What we were doing here was trying to use evidence-centered design, that principled design approach, to better think about using universal design for learning in assessment design of large-scale, statewide science assessments. So not classroom, but big statewide assessments. So what we did was we actually took some released items and redesigned some released items using principles of universal design for learning. So for example, we might have broken up some of this text to help students decode the language of the symbols. We might be highlighting some of the critical features supporting their cognitive and executive functioning and managing of information. And then we would think very carefully about the representations. Are they really just representing the context, critical information? How much cognitive load is there? So we redesigned, I can't remember now, 20-some large-scale items that had been released. Did all kinds of funny counterbalancing, went to 2 states with, I can't remember now, 1,000 students. Tested the redesigns against the original items, and in both cases, students with disabilities and students without disabilities both increased performance. So our argument was that we were better able to allow students to show what they knew or could do through using universal design. But with the evidence-centered or principled design process underneath that, we were then able to tell others at scale how to do that. So that's how I'm thinking about aggregating and sharing knowledge with tools. I just wanted to show you, this is for Josh and his group that I met with this morning. This is one of the design documents that comes out of evidence-centered design. It's pretty scary. And this is like the first page of 15 or something. But the idea is that we actually put it into an online system where you can start to navigate around all of the design elements in sort of a more 3D way rather than a linear way, which is how we disseminate our knowledge in journals. Not so efficient. But I just wanted to give you a sense, here's some design elements underneath this particular category. So this is what it looked like. I just wanted to show you the form of that design. As scary as it is, it does show how much explicit reasoning goes into that kind of principled design approach. My work has also started to think about how to intersect with policy for impact. So some of the work that we've done, or that I did with some of my colleagues at SRI, was to take what we knew about effective pedagogical approaches and actually write a chapter in the PISA report that came out in 2016 about the 2015 science results that were being talked about from the US. So it was a way of talking about what is going on in the US instructionally, where are we still challenged, how are the pedagogical approaches that we're hearing about in innovative spaces really spreading or not spreading. And so I feel like it's really important to think about working in these intersections in order to increase the impact of our work beyond just our educational research community and for some of us, some of the teachers we work with. There is a world in which all of these things come together in my brain. It doesn't look so nice and pretty. But I wanted to say that one of the problems of working in the intersections or working in the interstitial or margins is that there's not a lot of easy funding for it. You have to actually educate funders about the importance of the work and get them to come along on a journey with you a lot of the times. So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying we need to pay attention to how and what our funders are doing and saying and what they think is important and how we can impact them to get them to support the kind of work we think is important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I can't say all this stuff without being clear about the practicals. So today's topic about aggregating knowledge in translational research approaches for me sits at the intersection of our three, without policy really so much, but it has implications for of research, tools and methods, and practice. Again, I do think that down the pike we'll be able to think about some implications for policy, but I'm not claiming we're doing that right now in this conversation. All right, so introduction done. Audience participation. Since 1980, I found some numbers that told me how much money had been appropriated for the U.S. Department of Education since 1980. So that's basically 40 years. How much money do you think, by show of hands, has been spent by the U.S., not state, U.S. Department of Education since 1980? How many people think, by show of hands, 100 billion? Okay, a couple. Great guess. 500 billion? There's more? Yeah. This is like the Price is Right, right? You can't go over by $1. Is it 750 billion? Is it $1 trillion? Okay. This is great. I love this. And this is such a badly worded question, Dan. I know. Like, the assessment people in the room are like, does she do assessment design? Because that's terrible. 1.8, almost 1.8 trillion. There's a spreadsheet. You can go and get it and play with it. It's right there on that link. So in 2011, my old boss at SRI, Barbara Means, was asked by Congress to come and answer the question. We've spent 1.8 billion, or trillion dollars, I can't even, it's unbelievable, on education since 1980 alone. How come we don't have a STEM literate population? Explain it to us. And others have been asked this question. Diane Ravitch has written about it. Lots of folks have been talking about this for a long time. But I just like to tell the story that she was held up in front of Congress. She said, we don't have a systematic understanding of implementation of our interventions. And in particular, we don't know about the variables of context that impact implementation of specific interventions. We don't know about it. We're just starting to learn about the ways that the diversity of our students impacts the way our designs work in our classrooms. How students engage, what cues of engagement there are that they pick up, that then they engage with our instruction in a way that's interpreted in the way that we think we've designed it to lead to opportunities to learn and thus potentially learning gains. I mean, that's a long causal chain. So that's what she told them. I tend to agree, and I just want to be clear that when I'm talking about designs and interventions today, and generally in my language, I'm not very specific because I really am talking about the classroom activity system, curricula, instruction, technology, assessments, pedagogical approaches, and as you'll hear, as you've probably heard, I'm also thinking about the policy context in which those designs are implemented. The school, the district, the state, the national, and now in some cases the global context in which we do our work. This is complicated stuff. But just to give you a concrete example, a lot of people don't know what I'm talking about when I say local conditions or contextual variables. I learned it first in assessment. I was designing science assessments, and I was thinking I was, let's say, designing for 8th grade content, and I would go sit in a class, and I wouldn't understand the variation that I was getting in my classroom assessments. And then somebody very generously and kindly said to me, "You don't know anything about reading. You don't know anything about the reading challenges, the language challenges that are in this classroom. Fix it." Okay, so a local condition completely broke my design. That's it. That's probably a good concrete example that a lot of people can think about and resonate with in assessment. But we're all starting to think about more subtle and complex pieces, like what are the diversity of cultural perspectives of our students that impact the ways in which they engage with our designs, right? So there's a lot to think about when we think about the local conditions. And when we do that work, when we tend to learn about those richly and deeply, we need to start thinking about aggregating that knowledge as a field. Okay, so participatory or translational methods, I'll get to the terminology in a second, hold on. I know there's a lot of ways that people talk about these methods and they've existed for a long time, but I'm just trying to use a shorthand to get us all on the same page. Participatory or translational methods, I'm thinking about this intersection between our two circles of research and practice at the moment. And what I'm talking about are researchers and practitioners in partnership. This is not, I've made a design, I'm giving it to my teacher who works with me, he or she is going to implement that, and then I'm going to videotape that, and then I'm going to analyze that, and that's the extent of it. I'm not even talking about I'm bringing a teacher to a design conference where they get to have an opinion, and that helps the design be co-designed, but it's over. I'm talking about a true long-term partnership, if you could get a long-term partnership, but at very least, defining this problem space as partners and the solutions as partners, not just help me understand how this will work better in your classroom. So again, some of the goals of participatory or translational methods, and by the way, when I talk about researchers and practitioners, it can be a small team, it can be a very large team of researchers and practitioners working together. It's of any size and scale. But the idea is that it's an interdisciplinary endeavor from the beginning. So again, the goal is to better understand local conditions, to understand how research or design plays in classrooms and why, or in other educational spaces, museums. I'm just using classroom as an educational space shorthand. As a way to identify the problems of practice that actually matter right now, I can think it's really important to teach all students about systems thinking, which I do. There's not a lot of teachers out there who are going to say, that's a persistent problem of practice that I need to solve right now. I'm just going to admit that right now. But we need to think about, not only are we trying to think about good and lasting solutions, impactful solutions, we're actually trying to think about novel problems. So we can come up with novel interventions that actually have impact, that use what we know as researchers and what our practitioners know as professionals as well. In that way, we can think about solutions that advance both fields simultaneously. And that's what I mean by translational, and yes, I'll get to that term in a minute. Hold tight. Also, a goal of participatory or translational, sorry Dan, this is like not even 101 for you, this is like, sorry, I just feel like I'm boring you. We need to generate evidence about relationships amongst local conditions and interventions. Okay, so we have our design. We can go into a context where we want to implement design with our partner and say, okay, what are the local conditions that matter for this design? But we need to make a science of that thinking and that evaluation and reflection on how the local conditions interact with our designs. That is a science of education that we need to engage in as a community. Okay, so here come our tools and methods for helping us aggregate that knowledge. a lot of folks in this room know about implementation research, and that there's been implementation in fields around education, other social sciences, health sciences, et cetera, that have some tools that we've started appropriating for education. You might know the term implementation research, implementation science, improvement science. You might know those words, the Carnegie Foundation. That's the kind of space that I'm thinking of, where there is an actual set of tools and approaches and practices for helping us do that work of seriously, carefully implementing what we're doing, watching those conditions, and then, I'm going to argue, level up that knowledge and be able to disseminate it. So we've heard about the goals, and I want to say that they come from some great traditions and also some newer methods that you might have heard of. I'm just trying to make connections for folks in the room to other methodological approaches that you know. Design-based research was one of the first learning sciences participatory methods that I learned as a student with co-design. Talked about design-based implementation research and also researcher-practitioner partnerships. You probably know that term. Does anybody not know what that term is? Okay, well, I'm going to say it anyway in case anybody's afraid to say they don't know what it is. This is when we work either a team of researchers or a small group of researchers or a large group at university with practitioners, usually in a system, a district, schools, but usually in a district, over a long period of time. And they're meant to inform one another in that way that I've been talking about. There's probably lots of others, Dan. You probably know other traditions that folks would resonate with in order just to know where I'm drawing the boundaries around this space. Are there others you can think of, Dan?
I think you can put almost all of them into one of those categories.
One of those categories?
Some little splinters, but...
Yeah. So we're getting there.
I do like, though, that you pointed out that DBR with co-design is different than DBR.
Yeah, I can't just leave that off, yeah. But now I'm going to problematize that space a little bit and say it's not enough. A lot of times we work as researchers or as a team of researchers with one partner or one partner site. So we're learning about one setting. And that's great. Joshua said to me this morning, it's so nice we get these case studies, but, that's the case studies but question. We're also usually focused on a single intervention. So we're not learning about the variation in our designs as much as well either. We might be doing that chronologically in series. I'm doing something, then I'm refining, then I'm refining, then I'm refining. But we might not really, go too far off the ranch. And then also, culminating all of this is we're not yet really formally or systematically documenting or disseminating the information that we're learning about the interaction between design and local context. So, are there ways in which people are trying to generate evidence about relationships among local conditions and interventions across settings? That would be the next logical step. A research question that we would ask in that space is how or why do the same or similar interventions or slightly variant interventions interact with conditions differently across settings? That would be the kind of research question we would ask there. I would argue that there's a couple of ways that it's being done in the field now. And I'm going to introduce a new, slightly variant term on RPP, calling it linked RPPs. It's the notion that there are multiple researcher-practitioner partnerships working collaboratively to understand how an intervention can be taken up across settings. So one group that's famously been associated with networked improvement communities, or NICs, is the Carnegie Foundation for Teaching and Learning. I have to stop here and say, NICS was a term invented by Douglas Engelbart at SRI back in the 70s. Just saying. So networked improvement communities is a really strong candidate for folks who can do this kind of work. I'm going to problematize what they did, but that's an example of a linked RPP model. NSF also funded the Science of Learning Networks over the past 10, 15 years in an attempt to get researchers working on a similar problem of practice to come together to share knowledge. Nice, looking at me, she's going, no, but didn't do it, right? So, there's attempts at trying to link up these efforts, and it's not simple. These are big scale research efforts. So, bear in mind that to address this question, you got to bring a lot of resources to the table. That's that big yellow dollar sign from before. Okay, and then I'm just going to throw this out there for fun to talk about. Learning engineering to me is kind of an interesting approach. It's not a huge scale of people. It's not necessarily aimed at disseminating information, but it is a way we can gather a bunch real fast, right? There's an engineer, hopefully, working with a researcher and a practitioner. I know these coordinations aren't quite well established yet or what the practices are, but that's maybe where, if you folks are thinking about what a graduate program in learning engineering might look like, or what does a learning engineer do when they get out in the world, that might be you. Think about how those practices can be set up for best practices to start thinking about some of this, the potential of learning engineering to give us some information that we can better share out. Okay, now I'm going to problematize that space, because this is what we do for a living. Those large-scale linked RPPs are really uncommon. For obvious reasons, the resources that you need are hard to marshal. Setting up those partnerships with practitioners who have 1,000,001 things to do and 1,000,001 constraints on their practice and their time and their goals, getting them involved at that level is really, really tough. The way you enter into systems to get practitioners involved in linked RPPs, that's a big one. It's still, I think, a mystery, for a lot of us. Tammy Clegg and I are talking about writing an NSF workshop to get people to talk about how to build strategic partnerships like this. Complex, yes. But again, you got to kind of focus it down a little bit. I would say you have to focus on at least a group of similar interventions in order to be able to have a common language to talk across. But we're still going to be pretty limited in what we can look at in those. So we really need multiple instances of linked RPPs. This is my argument. And even when, let's take Carnegie as an example, we have had examples of linked RPPs, they did not systematically document or disseminate what they learned about context around remedial math and community colleges. I've asked them, is it okay for me to say that publicly? And several of the senior folks there will say, yeah, that is okay to say, because we made a choice to do the work, and it was tough, and it was hard, and that wasn't where we were, and it was a mistake. So there you have it. I asked, because I love them, but I don't want to be mean. So with all of those challenges, the goal really, again, is I'm going to put this up here just to keep us focused on what I'm trying to get us to, which is if we have linked RPPs, if we have these opportunities, what are the tools and methods we need to support knowledge aggregation? And can we take those outside of linked RPPs? Can we take those and use those in our DBR in ways that can be impactful? So here I am thinking about this intersection of research, practice, and tools for impact. So this is what I'm saying is the grand challenge. For me right now, this is what I'm trying to get done in education research. Okay. It takes a lot to cue all that up, especially if you're not sure where people, where they are with their knowledge about this background. So I'm going to go into the translational terminology now, just as a side note, to put us all at ease. But no, I'm not just trying to translate what I know for the rest of the world. It's the shorthand for that family of methods and tools that I've been talking about. There's other terms, situated, which is what I thought Dan might come up with. We've had participatory. Angela Booker on Friday talked about relational design. In her world, she's thinking about the relationships amongst communities and people that are trying to accomplish some goals. And she thinks about it very large scale, systematically the way I do. And she was focusing on the human interactions, and so she was calling it relational design. It's beautiful work. But yeah, there's a family there. Did I leave translational in the title to be intentionally misleading? A little bit. But also I know that I can even see it on your faces. You're like, translational, that's not enough. That's not what you're talking about. You're kind of undercutting your message there. So you clever folks. I like to point you to a paper that was given to me in 2004. So, before a lot of these ideas had really gelled enough for me. And this is like this incredibly complex image, I'm sorry, but it is really kind of cool. Paul Carlisle at Boston University, who's an organizational scientist, has been thinking about what it means to share knowledge across disciplinary boundaries. And he came up with this 3T framework. There's other stuff in here that I could explain if you like. But he says that a lot of our work is about transfer. We take our thing, we toss it out there, and we say, take what I've learned and apply it in your context. Some of the work that's participatory, I'm going to say, is pretty close to translation. We're translating across one another, but I'm taking what you know from practice, you're taking what I know from research, and we're trying to make something work. And he's arguing that really what you want is what he's calling transformational interdisciplinary work. And that's that point I pointed to earlier where what we really want to do is ask new questions because of the knowledge that we bring to the table, develop novel solutions that we would never come up with without all the stakeholders at the table. Nora Sabelli, who I will talk about later, used to tell this story about a district intervention that was going on in Minnesota around scheduling. They were trying to play with the bell schedule to get kids to, engage better at first hour, be engaged throughout the day. They were trying to figure out what to do with their bells. And they kept coming up with these solutions, and they kept not really being satisfied with them. And as the stakeholders were sitting around the table, they're like, what's missing here? We don't understand what's missing. Something's not quite working. And the janitor walked by and was listening to the conversation and said, you forgot X in the system. You forgot Y. This is not how the kids go from here to here. They do this totally other thing. And so it's this illustration of how all stakeholders have information about what goes on in a system that's important that aren't always invited to the table because they don't play an instruction. Okay, so that's a little bit about translation, and I will give Nora Sabelli the final word on that at the end of the talk. But going back to our ground challenge, developing tools and methods to support knowledge aggregation in participatory and transformational methods. And so I've changed the title now to be Aggregating Knowledge about Context and Implementation, just to get away from that word. But I wanted to make sure that the abstract was communicative. Okay. I think we need two things here. And the first is infrastructure to capture our insights. Is what I've been kind of beating on this whole time. So methods and tools for capturing our designs, what we know about the context in which they're going to be used, and to talk about our analysis. The information that we get isn't always transparently interpreted in our journals so that others can understand how we came to the conclusions we came to. We do this in data analytics a lot. We aggregate data, we make dashboards and visualizations, and the people who use them don't necessarily know how the data were aggregated or what algorithms were used to generate those data, and sometimes that matters. So in any case, we need to think about being very clear about our methods and our tools, from the design to the context we're going into, and what are the conditions that are very important there, and what is our analysis. So I like to go through the Journal of Learning Sciences and say, oh, this person actually mentioned grade level, where the school was, but nothing about the perspectives of the students who come to the class. You might get a little bit about the teacher's background, but not always a lot about students. So what you do get is like free and reduced lunch, maybe, if you're reading outside of Journal of Learning Sciences. You might get a little bit of ethnic background data, demographic data, but not much. So how are we capturing what's important about context? Are we even doing it systematically on the few variables that we care to track so far? I would say we're not. And as we start to think more carefully about what are the variables of context that matter for our designs, we can start to think about developing common language about the design features and the interactions between design features and contextual variables. When we start to think about common language, then we can start to think about variation. That is where the rich stuff of our work is. We like case studies because we know that the variants matter, but we actually need to understand that variation more systematically so that we can better design and understand what's going on in classrooms, museums, homes, wherever you work. And if we can start to think about common language and variation and start to put some language around that, we might then be able to think about how do we disseminate that across our community of researchers. You know you can ask questions at any time, right? Should have said that. Oh, yes. So I'm bringing back the form of evidence-centered design here to say that I know what I'm asking sounds like a lot, because it is. And this is why we don't always explicitly write down our stuff, because we're trying to get our work done. But we kind of have to do that. We kind of have to hold our feet to the fire to do that. And whether it's evidence-centered design or activity theory, as Joshua's lab uses it, or any other form of principled design, we just have to, we need to be more systematic in our thinking and in how we share what we do. But I did want to show you at least one version of this. The other piece I think we have to take on as a community is a systems perspective on our work. I think I've already probably gone through the whole iteration of student, teacher, classroom, grade level, school, site, district, region. So many aspects of the system impact what goes on in the minute to minute of our students, and yet we don't always attend to all those levels. Even being able to understand the system you're in and how you impact it, right, requires that level of reflection. I was speaking with a very senior and generous and thoughtful and well-cited and well-intentioned and wonderful researcher recently, and I said to him, "Oh wow, what's interesting about the district contracts you're working in?" He says, "I don't work in the district, I work in the classroom." And I went, "Whoa, pull your head up a little tiny bit and tell me what goes on in the district that impacts that classroom." So that's been a wonderful conversation to have with a lot of folks. But it's the idea of understanding that the landscape is actually a little bit broader often than just our classroom. And we can think of lots of examples where accountability or teacher evaluation policies from the district have just killed an intervention that we had in the classroom. Time management or other pressures on the teacher have just, our stuff becomes unimportant, right? So we work in that landscape. We have to be able to describe it and think about it. And then we need to be able to describe what are the components in that system, the actors, the non-actors, the policies, and the dynamics that are going on in there. Who has power? Who has capital and social and professional capital? How do changes get made in institutions? If we're not talking about that, then we're not really thinking about the context of implementation in a way that's going to allow us to not only implement the way we want our solutions, have those implementations and those designs have meaning for each of the stakeholders, have them sustain over periods of time and be adapted to continue to meet the needs of the stakeholders even after we've left the room, and then to scale. So those are the two pieces where I'm working to develop methods and approaches that help us aggregate that knowledge. One example of the work I'm doing right now that captures those pieces is with Lucas Education Research. I convinced them to let me take some money, some of their internal money, to build a linked RPP across their grantees. So Lucas Education Research, that's George Lucas, Star Wars. It's really fun working there. I get to work with them about 1 day a week. They care a lot about project-based learning. And they've put a lot of money, millions of dollars, into developing project-based learning curricula and assessments in various domains like English language arts, science, math, etc., and at various grade levels. And they've been looking at all the different aspects that make project-based learning really interesting and powerful, like social emotional learning, building identity, authenticity, all kinds of really cool layers of pedagogical approaches within project-based learning. But they have grantees that don't necessarily talk to one another, as is typical in a funder's portfolio. And I thought to myself, how much time do I have? I thought to myself, you have this fantastic opportunity of folks working to understand implementation. You're doing DBIR, you're doing RPPs, but they're not talking to each other. Why is that? That seems like a very easy thing to do to get some more traction around this problem, because you care about implementation. At the end of the day, you can spend your millions, and if you can't get implementation to be high quality, what did you do? So we have these folks coming together to meet monthly over the course of a year and a half to think about what are the enabling conditions of their PBL implementation. Wherever it is, whatever it's about, what are the enabling conditions? So we have this one lens that we're using right now, which is enabling conditions at the school district level that either help or even hinder high quality implementation of their materials. And so one of the ways that we're getting on the same page is we built a system map. And people are researching various aspects of that system, but they always overlap. They always intersect in some way, so there's always something for these researchers to be talking to one another about. So we're doing all this to, develop the common language, think about the variants, and think about the landscape, the systems that they're in. The other cool thing about this collaboratory is that it is led by graduate students and postdocs. So the idea is you get the money from Lucas to do this work. If you can put a junior person in the driver's seat, mentored by the PI, the idea is to build the capacity to do this research in the field. So building capacity is always like the last goal of all of the things that I do. I just love this project. I'm going to write about it for ICLS. But that's one example of how we might do this work. Before I get to the final word on translation and scaling for Nora, I just want to reiterate that, as in the Lucas project, funders are not static entities. NSF is not just this big brick building. Okay, it is. But you can walk in that building and you can tell the program officers what's missing from the portfolio. They asked us that at Cyber Learning specifically, and I said research on practice and implementation. DBIR that we wrote about back in 2011 is in the DRK12 NSF RFP as a method that is acceptable work. That is how you move the field to do the kind of work that you think is important. At Cyber Learning, a student was walking out of a conversation that we were having about policy, said, "This isn't relevant to me." And I was like, "Sit down, please." His advisor was like, "Leave him alone." Policy is more relevant than you think. Both researchers and students need to hear this, I think. But like the OECD paper, that influences PISA, that influences the way we think about our national tests, that influences the way we think about our state tests and our classroom. I know assessment is the tail that wags the dog, but it's a great example of a way that you can get into policy. And maybe because I come from assessment, I did a lot of work in assessment, I think about that as a policy lever. All of our work is really a policy lever, and we got to think about good ways to get into that conversation. And then networks. I mean, obviously you see how important I think networks of researchers and practitioners and interdisciplinary teams are. But I also want to just say that the work of building a network to be able to do the work you want to do starts in grad school. My colleagues are the people I went to grad school with that were in grad school the time I was in grad school, and their PIs, their mentors are now my mentors as well. So the networks that you need to do work in the intersections is so valuable. Think about what you're doing here is not just research, but building your research networks that you're going to be working in for the rest of your career, whether you're in academia or at SRI or starting your own company. It all depends on your ability to be in the community and to learn from that community, talk to people, get access to resources, get great ideas. Okay, sorry, that was my little soapbox. So I'll give the final word to my original mentor. Okay, so no, Marsha Lynn was my original mentor, and there were people before that, my mom, my dad, but Nora Sabelli, for those of you who don't know, was one of the was a program director at NSF way back in the day, and she was one of the program directors who started getting funding for learning technologies out of NSF. Right, so here's policy impacting what we do, giving us the money and the resources to do the work we think is important. She was also at SRI after her tenure at NSF. She went back there and was a senior advisor there, and I got to work with her. And one of the first things she said to me was, we were talking about scaling interventions, and she said, it's not about the number of people, it's not about the number of schools, it's about, have you built capacity in a system for future change? For any number of reasons. One, because it doesn't really matter if it's your intervention or somebody else's. What you're trying to do is help people do their job at the end of the day to educate our kids. So are you building capacity in that system to change? It's not going to be static. It's going to undergo future change. So if you're not helping people do that by getting them to think about using continuous improvement methodologies, being part of our partnership as you go on, then you've touched a system, but chances are your thing is going to fade, and that system's going to look a lot the same as when you got there. So her notion of scaling to build capacity is what drives a lot of the work that I do. So thank you, Nora. And thank you for your time. And I really appreciate all of your feedback. Bring it on. I can't wait to hear it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Lots of food for thought. Do we have some questions?
Please.
Super interesting, thank you. Systematic documentation as part of the thing that we're talking about. Sorry, I'm losing it a little. I'm thinking about incentive structures for publication, and particularly incentive structures for teachers and for researchers, or academic researchers, I should say. So if you can speak a little bit about how we can make ourselves actually prioritize these things when they're deprioritized. And it would be interesting if you could also speak to your position now at Menlo EDU as kind of what the incentive structures maybe look like differently for you now
Yeah.
than they might if, you know.
Yeah, lunch is my incentive structure. Just what again, I'm from my desk Sundays. It's such an important, and when I've practiced this talk, I actually did touch on it, but I will say that Susan McKenney, who's an American researcher living in Denmark, has written, and she's integral to the Journal of Learning Sciences, has written a little bit about changing the evaluation routines at NSF. So when you are an evaluator evaluating a grant, you say, did the person do what they need to do? And then also, as a researcher, you're trying to show that you did what you were supposed to do. If we could change those evaluation structures to say that you actually took a look at the shift of ownership, for example, of me as the researcher coming in and doing this thing to a system, to is that capacity being built? Variations on that theme. You could start to move people's ideas about what actually counts as impact. So shifting of ownership, building capacity, showing that, teachers, I think a lot of folks in the teacher literature do this already, showing that teachers are taking up new practices. What about practices at the school level? To support something like project-based learning, you've got to have differences at the school level that matter. So changing the evaluation structure at NSF is one of those things, and Susan and I are talking about trying to, educate the program officers. How do we change the RFPs so that those evaluation criteria are more front and center? Because right now we have this thing called intellectual merit and broader impact, and people write the same boilerplate in those paragraphs every time, and it's like, oh, we're going to have more diversity in our students. I mean, I'm not saying that's not important. I'm saying that is so not enough.
Yeah.
So that's one way we're thinking about disseminating and changing the sort of incentive structures. Dissemination of this sort of knowledge about context to me, Joshua was saying that Vanessa Sfila has written a book about design, and I sometimes I feel like, we really just need it's really a new science in a way, if you think about it. Let me just be humble for like a minute. It's a new science in a way, or it's another layer to the science that we do that we need to think about, and so that does require new routines. And so there might need to be new journals, and I know, when we were thinking about design of games and DBR, there were folks trying to come up with different dissemination mechanisms there that didn't quite take hold. So I'm still grappling with that piece. I think as people do the work more carefully, or in this vein, it might come to evolve. The Improvement Science Summit that Carnegie holds is a place where people share out. But is it really getting traction in the field? I'm not quite sure how I feel about that, about the summit itself. But I know that a lot of people go. I know a lot of our colleagues go and learn a lot and bring it back and share out what they've learned. So there might be something there, but that's a big conference and you can get really lost in it. So I'm not quite sure. But the incentives piece, and I at Menlo EDU do not have the same incentives as an academic. I hold myself to want to publish and share ideas in the same way that an academic does, but I don't live or die by that. I don't get tenure or not get tenure because of that. The incentives for me are making sure that the people who work for me have interesting work, and that they want to continue to work on those projects. And so far, and having had the company in 14, 16 months, I guess, we now have 6 folks working together as a team on projects like this. So that to me seems like it's a good thing, but if everybody feels like they're doing their best, doing the work they want to do, that's a good incentive for me. But at the end of the day, you got to keep the lights on as well. So I don't know if that's super helpful, but that's at least some of my thinking in that area. That's a big space you asked about. But thank you for your question. It's definitely something that needs some work.
I had a question. It's a bit more technical, getting into the work. So I'm sure we can talk about more later, but I'm really interested in this idea of building capacity for linked RPPs. So I'm thinking about it across like even data management, like, you know, this a year and a half seems like such a short time span to do anything in this linked RPP kind of world. So I wonder, like, how do you manage and, you know, reflect on the data that you are collecting across these sites? Like, how do you organize that? And then also in this idea of building capacity, how do you educate some of these, I guess, funding entities in what enabling capacities are, or enabling things are at school sites? Like, so I'm just kind of interested in this like intersection of research practice and knowledge about schools to be able to push that thinking forward in the span of a year and a half.
Absolutely. Well, a year and a half came about because that's what they would pay for.
Okay.
Because given the size of their portfolio, they were willing to do a certain percentage of it, right? So there was a certain amount that they were willing to do, and so we thought, so we have 4 teams interspersed around the country that come together virtually. We have not asked them to share their data. They're working in such a different context, I'm not sure it would matter to how much they could share in terms of like the raw data, but they're definitely sharing protocols. They're sharing observation protocols, or analytic approaches, rubrics, especially of student work and project-based learning. So they're sharing their approaches, but they're not necessarily sharing the data yet. But what we really wanted them to come together around was to just start building that common language of the system that matters for them. I actually think once they build that system and have a representation they like, it'll work across a whole ton of things. So I feel like that to me is the main goal. The secondary goal of doing that work from my perspective is to think about how to do that work. It's like flying the plane and designing it and building it at the same time. But we haven't asked them to share data, but I will say that the NSF data management possibilities are really interesting. And I know that they've been partnering with several engineers, data scientists to think about how to go through that problem a little bit more carefully. But it's a slow, hard thing. I mean, you know what it's like to share data just across school districts.
So the enabling conditions are how are they getting at those then, is what I'm.
Yep. So I picked the Coburn 2003 outcomes because I thought those 4 outcomes would be broad enough and open-ended enough to capture everything that those teams had already set out to do in their proposals and were already on the way to studying. So Coburn's 4 outcomes of interventions are depth of change, not just did you implement it, but did you get a depth of change that you wanted to see in teacher practice, teacher beliefs, student practice, student beliefs. Spread within the site you're working with is one of her outcomes. Spread across sites is another one of her outcomes. Sustainability over time, and then shift of ownership. Sorry, that's 5. There's 4. Shift of ownership is a really, really big one for me. That's like the key. So I asked each of those teams to talk about how they would show evidence of those 4 outcomes. What were the things that enabled or hindered depth, spread within, spread across, sustainability, and shift of ownership? So there's a common framework that we're using.
Yeah.
And it's a light touch in a way, to make sure that everyone feels like they can participate and enter into that.
Right.
It's what Angela Booker called nodal intervention, something that's a light touch but has resonance throughout the system. So trying to figure out how to do this work, I'm just super interested in what folks think about that.
Naya?
Thank you so much for your talk. I heard a lot about, and like something that really resonated with me was when you talked a little bit about local conditions as well.
Yep.
So I have 2 questions that kind of link together. The first one is looking at the perceptions of data aggregation and data collection to society, and perhaps some ways that we can encourage positive perceptions of that collection in order, it's almost like a partnership with society.
Yeah.
So that we can now, work off of those partnerships and also collecting stories of the data so that it actually shows some form of face. And then also, before and during aggregation, how do we encourage culturally considerate aspects of these approaches that you talked about today so that those local conditions can be considered in a socially varied way?
Yes, all those things. Especially the last point, it's not lost on me that just because a researcher is taking into account, local conditions and thinking about the people in that system in as much of a culturally sensitive way as they possibly can, that the tools themselves don't always have some of those, unintended biases or unintended. I super appreciate that point and have not thought about it in terms of what I'm suggesting here being something that we need to do as a research community, that should also be subject to those questions. And that's really good food for thought for me. Thank you. Did you have
Me? Yep. So I have so much respect and enthusiasm for what you said earlier. The sentence was, we need to make a science out of context. And I want to I'll start with the question. How do you define context? And this is because I get this question a lot in my work. I come from a different tradition, but I find that people's responses are usually like, oh, it's whatever's convenient to measure, or it's everything. You know, Brian Baker says it's everything, or there's an infinitude of contexts, but neither is really constructive for
That's
making
not
a
helpful, yeah.
science. So I'm curious how you approach it. I know that's a big question, and you shouldn't be like responsible for defining context, but at the same time, I'm curious what you would say.
Yeah, what tradition do you come from, just out of curiosity?
Cognitive science
Cognitive
and
science.
learning analytics too.
I will start with a story, which is to say that when I was a first-year grad student, I was grappling with this question, and I asked Andy DeSessa, who was my second dissertation reader, to hold a summer reading class for our cohort to help us understand this question of context. 3 months later, with just Andy and like 5 other students, still had no idea. Still struggling with that. But you know, it's a long question. And so the way I've kind of come to it is that as I do my work, as we do our work, if we're talking about the things that matter for our designs, aggregate, it'll start to come together as this is what's important over here. And it might be that, you know, you got to think about 90% of them all the time. I hope that's not the case. But I don't know the answer. But I think it has to come out of us doing the work around our particular pieces and thinking about what those interactions are that are critical, that are hindering, that are enabling, and then we can start to think across what are the pieces that have to be that are core when you're doing PBL, when you're doing formative assessment, when you're doing X, when you're doing Y. So I feel like it's coming about from being built up from individual pieces of work. But like anything else, I feel like it's kind of an empirical endeavor, not a philosophical one, although, you know, I do try and come from the top down all the time. I have conjectures about what matter from the theory, and then I can find out, yeah, this did in this case, or no, it didn't. Is that helpful? I mean, it's just sort of evolving at the moment, I think is what I'm saying.
You're right, like there hasn't been so many efforts to collect data from multiple contexts that we even have the sort of way of doing it bottom up. Like we can't do factor analysis because we don't have data from lots of different contexts.
That's correct.
Yeah, so maybe just the few examples could start to become formative in developing that taxonomy. Would that be cool? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I think we have time for one more question. Dan?
So, we used to always tell people to consider SRI. I mean, it was such an awesome team, and it's kind of sad that it's, so I wonder if you could update that advice. You've got a good eye on the landscape, West Eds, there are a bunch of other places.
Yeah.
They're not SRI, but it offers a similar thing. So I wonder what advice you have for graduate students in terms of working outside of academia, but staying within the research realm.
Yeah. Was that a snap?
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that was sad, because it really was. And it was a useless thing that got done, that got walked back, but the network of people had been distributed at that point. The way I think about the community of SRI, just as a follow-up to your point, is that I stay in league with those people as if they were down the hall from me. I try and do that. I try and support the junior researchers the same way I would as if they were down the hall from me. So as long as I'm still in my network, I don't have the place, I don't have the institution, but I still have that network, and I still live very much there. And I will say West Ed is a great example where some of our colleagues from SRI went and have been very, very happy. I will also say that the Statway Quantway group that was at Carnegie Foundation actually live at West Ed now. So that work now lives at West Ed. Carnegie still does the improvement science, but the RPPs, the NICs, are at West Ed. So it's a great place if you can build the structure around it. So those senior people managed to negotiate with West Ed to get what they needed to put their group there. But that's, again, you have to kind of think about the system of how you're going to get your money, how you're going to get resources, how you're going to do what you're going to do. But I think West Ed has quite a bit of latitude for junior researchers as well. SRI was a little hard for junior researchers. I think Wested's actually, because their overheads are really low, they can do a lot more research that junior researchers can come in and be a part of. So Wested's a great place for that. There are other nonprofits that are coming up that are organizations that are closer to schools, that work with schools more regularly. Like you might think about the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. You know, that's a group of people doing research in Silicon Valley with Silicon Valley schools, and they're hiring researchers. So you can be in, you know, place-based or partnership-based organizations as well, and do research at all the different levels. I'm trying to think of other places.
AIR?
Districts, well, I don't know as much about AIR, but I feel like they're so connected to large-scale work that I don't know that this kind of work would really have a home in AIR, but certainly other forms of research do. I will also say that school districts are more and more hiring internal researchers and evaluators to work within their systems. They're like the internal RPP. And I work with several school districts now where we're putting capacity into their research and evaluation teams. I call them hybrid RPPs because they're super light. They're like 2 years. You work with the district, you build up that team, you help them think about how to put continuous improvement cycles into place within their own district, and then you've got people there that live there forever, or, you know, as long as they have a job there, but you have routines and practices that live there forever, and the researcher doesn't have to, you know, necessarily be there. So, you know, think about working with districts, think about working as an internal researcher and evaluator. But there's so many ways to do it, and then if you're like me, you're still not happy, start your own.
Well, thank you, Britta. This was wonderful.